Hello, welcome to OFFBEAT GYAN. I am Deepa Nair, and today's video is on James Baldwin's long essay, Notes of a Native Son. Usually when I take a class, I read the text and then I proceed to explain it line by line. And I tend to blabber a lot, something that I'm going to curb in today's video because I don't want you to get bored and leave the video halfway. I just hope that I'll restrict myself to the most important points which will help you in all the future examinations that you're all planning to write. So all the best to all of you, and let us jump into Notes of a Native Son. But before we go on to talk about the essay, let me give you some biographical details about James Baldwin. James Baldwin was born in 1924 in Harlem. Harlem is in Upper Manhattan, New York City, United States of America. A predominantly African American neighborhood, and the family was very poor, so Baldwin grew up in very impoverished circumstances. His mother, Emma Jones, had been a single mother when she had James Baldwin, and she had been part of the Great Migration, when a lot of black people or African Americans moved from the southern parts of the United States to the north. So she decided to remain a single mother and look after her child, but then after some time she got married to a Baptist preacher, David Baldwin, and James Baldwin decided to take up the surname of his stepfather. And he managed to get quite a good education, and he had a membership in one of the libraries in Harlem, and that is how he sustained or rejuvenated his interest in reading, despite the circumstances that he was born in, that he found himself in, very impoverished circumstances. So by the time he was 14 years old, he became a preacher, and he was a very good speaker. In fact, he was able to speak in such a way that he realized the power that he had over the audience, the people listening to him. And over a period of time, a sort of disillusionment crept up in him regarding the church's stand on two very important issues. One is that of racial inequality, and the other is that of the church's homophobia. Baldwin had discovered his sexual orientation over a period of time. He discovered that he was a homosexual, and so there was a distinct break between his beliefs and the church's intolerant attitude towards homosexuality and its stance on racial inequality. By the time he left high school, Baldwin had started writing non-fiction, small pieces, and he used to write essays, and he found that life in America was becoming increasingly restricted. His freedom was hugely restricted because of his race, because of his color, and this sort of created a feeling of suppression, a feeling of suffocation and frustration within him. And so he got a writing fellowship, and he moved away to Paris in 1948. And from Paris he started writing once again. Throughout this period he kept on writing. So what concerns us is Notes of a Native Son. Notes of a Native Son was published in 1955. 1955. Okay, and this is an essay which is a reflection of his complicated, very complex relationship with his stepfather, and it also talks about race, exile, culture, African American issues, racial inequality, all these things. So it's quite a long essay, and what I'll be dealing with is just two sections of this long essay. So it's very interesting, this essay, and there are a number of sub-themes in the essay. He doesn't actually have a very focused way of writing. While he's writing, he also writes about a number of other sub-themes, and these sub-themes are depicted in a very interesting way by James Baldwin. So another thing that is important is his style, the way he used to blend a number of emotions together within a single passage. So when you read a passage, you find that it is a blend of gentle emotions and aggressive emotions. Within the same passage, you will find both. Okay, so the passage, the lines of this particular sentence might begin in a very gentle way. Like for example, where he talks about his stepfather being very handsome, black and beautiful, and not realizing how handsome he is. And then again, in that same sentence, he compares his father to a fierce African warrior. So you have this blending of the gentle and the aggressive within the same passage. That is one very important thing about Baldwin's style. So if you get a question on Baldwin's style, this is something that you can write about, the blending of aggression and gentle feelings. Then another thing that we find in his essays is that they are very analytical, and at the same time they are very prophetic also. The way he speaks, it is like this is going to happen in the future, and the way he speaks, that is reflected in his writing also. So these are the basic things that you need to know about James Baldwin before you start the process of understanding the essay. So I've talked to you about his life, about his work, about the essay, and now we'll go into the essay. On the 29th of July in 1943, my father died. On the same day, a few hours later, his last child was born. James Baldwin begins the essay by telling us that his stepfather died on 29th of July in 1943. Two other important things happened on the same day. One was James Baldwin's last sibling was born on that day. Another thing was, it was also James Baldwin's 19th birthday. Okay, and on that day, fierce, violent riots had broken out in Detroit, followed by riots in Harlem. So on August 3rd, when the family was taking David Baldwin's body for the funeral, they went through the streets which were scattered with broken fragments of buildings, shops, and there had been a very violent riots in Harlem at that point of time. So when they were taking the body of James Baldwin's father to the funeral, the vehicle, it was driving through a road which was the symbol of anarchy, discontent and hatred. Okay, there had been riots between African Americans and white Americans, and the streets were scattered with fragments, broken fragments. Okay, and the violence that they saw when they were driving through the street is described by Baldwin in that paragraph there. It seemed to me too that the violence which rose all about us as my father left the world had been devised as a corrective for the pride of his eldest son. Okay, when they were taking the body in the hearse towards the graveyard, at that point of time, they were passing through streets which had been left completely devastated by racial violence. And Baldwin's father had always had this apocalyptic vision that life is basically very, very negative. Good things don't happen in life, and that sort of affected his entire personality also. Baldwin's stepfather's personality, that is what I'm talking about here. And when James Baldwin saw all this violence all around him, he also felt that his stepfather may have been correct. His stepfather may have been right in his assessment of life in America, in a very racially divided country, in a racially segregated country. Then in the next paragraph, he tells us that he had not known his father very well, his stepfather very well. They had a very complex and difficult relationship. They did not get along well, and both of them, he says, they had one common quality. Both of them were equally proud. They were stubbornly proud. James Baldwin and his stepfather. And it was only after his father died that James Baldwin realized that he had talked to him very rarely. There had been very few occasions when he had been able to talk comfortably with his stepfather or father. I'll be referring to him as father because James Baldwin keeps talking about him as father in the essay, not as stepfather. Then he tells us, he gives us some bits and pieces about his father's life. He tells us that his father was the son of a slave, and he was of the first generation of free men, and he had come to the north in 1919. This is what I had told you earlier, Great Migration. In this Great Migration, James Baldwin's mother had also moved from the south to the north. So there is a reference here to Old Country. Old Country refers to the southern part of the United States, the South, Deep South. It is also referred to as Deep South. These were the regions where slavery was deeply entrenched, and cotton plantations were there. And in these cotton plantations, a lot of Negroes or African Americans used to work. And when Abraham Lincoln came up with his Emancipation Declaration, the South declared war against the North. The southern part of the United States declared war against the northern part of the United States. Civil War broke out, and the North, of course, it won, and all the slaves had to be freed. So there was this great migration after that. In 1919, James Baldwin's father, David Baldwin, had moved from the Deep South or the Old Country to the northern part of the United States. So when James Baldwin's father was a young man, he had spent quite a lot of time in New Orleans. And New Orleans was a place which has become famous because of a very famous jazz musician, Louis Armstrong. And that paragraph tells us that James Baldwin's father did not like Louis Armstrong. So in James Baldwin's mind, New Orleans is associated with the wicked biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah were biblical cities which had been completely destroyed by God because of their wickedness. So James Baldwin associates New Orleans with that image. Okay, and James Baldwin's father had spent quite some time in New Orleans when he was a young man. And there is this incident that he talks about in that paragraph. My father never mentioned Louis Armstrong except to forbid us to play his records. But there was a picture of him on our wall for a long time. One of my father's strong-willed female relatives had placed it there and forbade my father to take it down. He never did. But he eventually maneuvered her out of the house, and when, some years later, she was in trouble and near death, he refused to do anything to help her. So that's a very interesting anecdote about his father's animosity or hatred towards Louis Armstrong. And he never talked about Louis Armstrong, and he forbade all his children. You're not supposed to play the records of Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong was a very famous trumpeter and a jazz musician. But then one of David Baldwin's very strong and very determined female relatives, she came one day to the house. She had a photo of Louis Armstrong and she placed it on the wall. And she told the family, you're not supposed to remove it. Okay. Especially David Baldwin. She told David Baldwin, do not remove the photo, it is going to be there. Because Louis Armstrong was a very famous African American icon, continues to be even today. And this female relative, she used to stay with them, with the family, with the Baldwin family. Over a period of time, James Baldwin's father, somehow or the other, he managed to evict this woman from the house. And after she had been evicted, she was in a very bad situation, and he never bothered to help her. Even when she was about to die, he refused to do anything to help her. And that is how he got his revenge on this female relative. Moving on to the next paragraph. This paragraph is a description by James Baldwin of his father, David Baldwin. So James Baldwin says about his father, he was, I think, very handsome. So there were a number of photographs in the house, and from the photographs, the son made out that his father had been a very handsome man. And when he used to dress in his Sunday best, the best clothes that you usually wear on a Sunday when you're going to church, then he looked very handsome and very proud. But at the same time, another picture that came into James Baldwin's mind was that he looked like a African tribal chieftain, a very commanding, very determined, very imposing figure, an African tribal chieftain, somebody with a lot of skulls hanging around their neck, with a spear in their hand. Okay, and then he goes on to tell us about his father. The qualities that come to James Baldwin's mind when he thinks about his father are all very negative. He says that his father was very bitter. He was very cruel. He could be indescribably cruel, and he had a crushing power. He was very, very unpopular. People did not like him. He did not get along well with people. Okay, and it had something to do with his blackness. I think he was very black. With his blackness and his beauty, and with the fact that he knew that he was black but did not know that he was beautiful. Now there is an irony there. See, I told you, throughout the essay you will find these contrasting feelings, contrasting emotions within the same line, within the same passage. Okay, James Baldwin tells us that his father was black, and his father knew that he was black. But what did he not know? He did not know that he was also beautiful. He was also very handsome. The only thing that he was aware of was that I am black in color. He never thought of himself as a handsome man, as a beautiful man. And then Baldwin tells us that his father had suffered a lot of problems while he was growing up, and he did love his children, all 9 of them. He loved them, but he did not know how to express his love towards his children. His children were all scared of him. They felt a feeling of fear, of menace when he came into the house, and their father was never able to establish a warmth, a contact with the children. See, there is an instance where he describes that his father would take one of the young children and place him on his lap. Usually when we place children on our lap, children calm down, they feel comfortable, they settle down. But on James Baldwin's father's lap, the child would become very, very fretful. The child would start crying. The child would want to just be put down. The child wouldn't want to sit on James Baldwin's father's lap. And so that is very ironical. And whenever he tried to help them with their homework, it would always end up in an argument between the father and the children. So he used to fly into rages. He used to become angry very quickly, James Baldwin's father. Then there is another statement that James Baldwin makes. If it ever entered his head to bring a surprise home for his children, it was almost unfailingly the wrong surprise. And even the big watermelons he often brought home on his back in the summertime led to the most appalling scenes. Poor man, I pity him. The father was probably a very loving, very kind, caring man, but he didn't know how to show it. He didn't know how to express it. So he used to come home with a watermelon on his back, thinking that I'm going to give it to my children and they'll be very happy. But even that turned out to be a disaster. And James Baldwin says that I do not remember in all those years that even one of his children was happy to see him. Usually when a father comes into the house, the children immediately, small children at least, they rush to go and meet their father. They want to share all the activities, the news, everything that has happened in school with their friends. But that kind of a atmosphere was never there in James Baldwin's house. That is what he's telling us here. Then again, I'm reading from the essay. From what I was able to gather of his early life, it seemed that this inability to establish contact with other people had always marked him and had been one of the things which had driven him out of New Orleans. So his unpopularity, his inability to establish an affectionate relationship with other people probably made him more and more isolated, and that is why he had left New Orleans and he had moved to the northern part of the United States. He had come to Harlem. When he by the time David Baldwin was on his deathbed, he had actually been admitted in an asylum because he was suffering from paranoia. And this was something that the family discovered much later. So he was admitted in 1943 in an asylum, and by July 1943 he had passed away. He had died. So while he was young and practicing as a preacher, they kept on moving from one church to another. And as the churches got smaller and smaller, the income also was reduced. The popularity of James Baldwin's father also plummeted. It went down. He became a very lonely figure. He became very, very isolated. He didn't have any friends. So when he died, there was nobody who came for the funeral other than the family members, the children and the wife. He had lived and died in an intolerable bitterness of spirit, and it frightened me as we drove him to the graveyard through these unquiet, ruined streets to see how powerful and overflowing this bitterness could be, and to realize that this bitterness now was mine. So all these things are going on through James Baldwin's mind while they are driving his father's body to the funeral. And James Baldwin realizes that the same bitterness that had entered his father's soul is gradually making inroads into his own soul also. He is also feeling bitter. He is also feeling anguished. So when James Baldwin's father fell sick and he was admitted to the asylum, at that point of time, James Baldwin had already left home and he was in New Jersey. He was in New Jersey. He was looking for work over there. And the next paragraph talks about the acceptance or the realization that his father had been suffering from paranoia. And the younger children, actually, when James Baldwin's father passed away, these younger children, they felt a sense of relief. Oh, now he's not going to come back. He's not going to torment us. That is the feeling that the children had when their father passed away. What sadness, what an ironic situation. The older children felt, with my father gone, that they could invite their friends to the house without fear, that their friends would be insulted, or, as had sometimes happened with me, being told that their friends were in league with the devil and intended to rob our family of everything we owned. So this is actually a reflection of the paranoia that James Baldwin's father suffered from, because he forbade his children to bring their friends home. He said, no, don't bring your friends home. They are all friends of the devil. And they were very poor. They lived in very impoverished circumstances. But James Baldwin's father had this overwhelming fear that these people are going to come into my house and they're going to steal something from there. So the children were always wondering, what is there to steal in this house? It's a very poor house. There is nothing worthy stealing, worthy of being stolen. And so they could not bring their friends home. They could not have a usual sort of the regular atmosphere, the normal atmosphere that most children have when they bring friends home. They sit together, chat and all that. That did not happen in James Baldwin's home, because James Baldwin's father was very, very particular that all these people are in league with the devil. So keep them away. So the children were actually very relieved. The children were actually feeling a sense of relief that now this overwhelming presence of their father's bitterness, their father's rage, their father's doubt and mistrust is not there. He's gone. He's not going to come back. Then moving on, next para. Okay, the next para again, James Baldwin tells us that when his father was committed to the asylum, at that point of time, they realized that he was also suffering from tuberculosis. The disease of his mind allowed the disease of his body to destroy him. And the doctors could not force him to eat. He was fed via tubes. Okay, but from the beginning itself, it was very clear that he is not going to survive. He will eventually die. And then in the next paragraph, James Baldwin tells us that he could imagine, he could visualize his father sitting near the window in their small house, and his mind created all these terrors, all these fears, all these inexplicable worries, the anxiety. And that is what made him hate and fear everyone, including his own children. Towards the end, he stopped eating because he had this fear that somebody is trying to poison him. Whenever James Baldwin's mother put something in front of him to eat, he would look at the food with suspicion. He doubted that it was poisoned and he would not eat it. And he spent great energy and achieved, to our chagrin, no small amount of success in keeping us away from the people who surrounded us. People who had all-night rent parties to which we listened when we should have been sleeping. People who cursed and drank and flashed razor blades on Lenox Avenue. He could not understand why, if they had so much energy to spare, they could not use it to make their lives better. So basically what this paragraph talks about is his very hostile behavior towards their neighbors. As I told you, they lived in very impoverished circumstances. Most of the people who were their neighbors, they used to indulge in all-night parties. They used to be drinking. There used to be violence also. And James Baldwin's father always kept these people at a distance. He looked at them with distrust and suspicion, and in many ways, he was a very self-righteous man. Why can't you better your lives? Why are you wasting your time like this? That was his attitude towards his neighbors. So the other members of the family, even if they wanted to have a good relationship with their neighbors, it was not possible with the domineering figure of James Baldwin's father, looking at all of them, chastising them, correcting them, preventing them. I hope it is clear so far. Moving on. So then, in the next paragraph, James Baldwin tells us that the only people who had the courage, who had the instinct to visit the house, who had to visit the house, were welfare workers and bill collectors, and they were invariably white people. And his mother was the person who dealt with them, because his father used to fly into anger. His father used to be very, very vengeful and angry whenever he talked to white people. So it was his gentle, kind, loving mother who used to interact with these bill collectors and welfare workers. And whenever a white person came into the house, James Baldwin's father behaved as if his territory was being violated. That is the attitude that he had towards the white people. Then James Baldwin tells us a very interesting incident. He says that when he was 9 or 10 years old, he had a young white school teacher. She was very interested in James Baldwin. She gave him books to read, and she also understood that he has the ability to write drama. Somebody with instinct for theatre. So she decided that she would take him to see a real play, a real performance. And James Baldwin already knew that this is not going to happen. His father would not give him permission to go to the theatre, and that too with his white school teacher. But he did not tell her all these things because he wanted her to come home to talk to his father and then take him, if possible, to the theatre. So he told her that she should come to his house one evening and pick him and take him to the theatre. He informed about this outing to his mother. Very cleverly, he told his mother that my school teacher is going to come. She wants to take me to the theatre, and you should somehow or the other work it out with father and get me the permission to go to the theatre with my white school teacher. And so his mother, she talked to his father. She told him, see, this white woman, she is coming here, and she is very interested in our son. She wants to expose him to drama, to theatre, to performance, and she's a school teacher. She's a kind woman. She's coming all the way to our neighborhood to take our son with her. So I think we should let him go. Okay, and it is a part of his education. Education was something that was very, very respected. That was something that was high up in the stakes in James Baldwin's father's mind. So when she used the word education, he decided, okay, I will let my son go with this white school teacher. Before the white school teacher came to take James Baldwin with her for the performance, James Baldwin's father came and asked him certain questions. Why is she so interested in you? Why does she want to take you to the theatre? So he had this feeling that probably his son would tell him, please don't let me go with the white school teacher. But James Baldwin did nothing of that sort. And against his wishes, the father had to let the son go with the white school teacher. In the next paragraph, James Baldwin tells us that his father lost his job, and during that period when they were going through a very difficult patch, at that point of time, it was the school teacher, this white school teacher, who was very helpful for the family. And his mother, she used the term Christian to refer to this white school teacher who helped them get through that very difficult winter. And his father always treated this white school teacher with disdain. He never treated her with respect. He never trusted her. And he was always trying to find out something wrong. He was always very distrustful of this white school teacher, this kind woman who helped James Baldwin and his family. And later on, he says, James Baldwin tells us, in later years, particularly when it began to be clear that this education of mine was going to lead me to perdition, he became more explicit and warned me that my white friends in high school were not really my friends, and that I would see when I was older how white people would do anything to keep a Negro down. Some of them could be nice, he admitted, but none of them were to be trusted, and most of them were not even nice. James Baldwin's father had this feeling of distrust, had this feeling of anger and rage towards the white people. He felt that white people would not behave nicely, would not behave well with black people. And that was the feeling that he tried to inculcate in all his children also, that you should never trust a white person, that they're never going to be kind to you, that they're never going to help you. And if you continue to have white friends at school, then that will only lead to your doom, your destruction. Perdition meaning doom or destruction. And he kept on telling them, keep away from the white people. It was like a warning that he kept on delivering to all his children. Ignore the white people, keep them at a distance. Okay, and James Baldwin did not have the same sentiments. He had a number of white friends also, and he felt that things are not going to change. His white friends would always continue to be kind to him, would be his friends. Probably the realization that his color made him different came to him at a later stage of life, not at this point of time. Okay, going on to the next paragraph. In 1942, the year which preceded my father's death, that is in 1942, there was a great change that happened in James Baldwin's life. He had been living in New Jersey and he had been working in defense plants. And New Jersey is in southern USA. and he had been living among the Southerners, both black and white. He knew about the South, he says, but he knew about how the white people in the southern part of the United States treated the Negroes and how the Negroes were expected to behave over there. But he did not think that this feeling of difference would be something that he personally, individually would experience. We all have this feeling that it's always going to happen to other people. It's not going to happen to me. I'm different. So the same thing happened to James Baldwin also. He felt that, okay, the Southerners treat Negroes very badly, but that doesn't mean that they're going to treat me badly. I learned in New Jersey that to be a Negro meant precisely that one was never looked at, but was simply at the mercy of the reflexes the color of one's skin caused in other people. Okay, this is a very important lesson that he learned in New Jersey. He realized that people will treat you according to the color of your skin, and that is a realization that he had only after he had moved to New Jersey. He did not know that because he had a different skin color, he had to behave in a particular way. He had to follow certain rules. He had to abide by certain restrictions. That was a realization that came to him very late in New Jersey. I had scarcely arrived before I had earned the enmity, which was extraordinarily ingenious, of all my superiors and nearly all my co-workers. As soon as he arrived in New Jersey and started working in the defense plant, he attracted animosity. All the people around him, his co-workers and his superiors, everybody disliked him. Everybody hated him. He did not know why people were behaving with such animosity towards him. He didn't understand why they were being so hostile towards him. He did not know what he said or what he did, what made them so hostile towards him. So what happened was, once he went to this restaurant, and it was a self-service restaurant. He went there 3 times, and he stood on the counter along with a number of other boys who were studying in Princeton University, one of the very reputed universities in the world. And he stood there waiting for a hamburger and a coffee, and nobody served him. Nobody put anything in front of him. And it was only when he went there the 4th time that he realized that nothing was ever kept in front of him. Nobody served him. It was something that he usually picked up on his own. Nobody told him that you are not going to be served here because of your skin color. Okay, he did not realize that as a Negro, he is not supposed to go to that particular self-service restaurant because it is meant only for white people. That realization was not there in James Baldwin when he arrived in New Jersey. It took him some time, a lot of bad experiences, to realize that segregation is very much alive and it is very, very active in New Jersey. By segregation meaning separation, separate facilities for black people and white people. So when he came to know, one day what happened was, he realized that, okay, Negroes are not served here. And he was told, and he kept on waiting there, and he only then did he look around and he realized that he is the only Negro present over there. So he became very, very determined, like, I'm going to go there again and again, I'm going to make sure that they serve me. But the next time that he went, there was something bad. A lot of bad things happened to him, and he never went to that restaurant after that. So this was something that happened across New Jersey, wherever he went. When he went to a bar or a bowling alley or a diner or a place to live, everywhere he found this hostility. He found this anger directed towards him because of his skin color. And he was always forced to leave. Quietly, he left the place. And children used to laugh at him. Elders used to whisper behind his back. They used to shout at him. And everybody started believing that he was mad. And finally, what happened? It started working on his mind. It affected his mind. See, when you're walking on a street, you see children laughing at you, giggling behind your back, people, adults shouting at you, making fun of you. That will naturally affect your mind. And he felt that he was sort of going mad, and he wanted to go somewhere or the other, but everywhere he found these restrictions because of his skin color. And this affected his work also. So when he went for work also, what happened was he was thrown out. He was fired. Okay. And somehow or the other, with the help of a friend from New York, he would get back into the job. Again, he would be fired. Again, he would come back. Third time, it took a longer while to send him away, to dismiss him from his job. Okay. But what happened was, this time when he was dismissed, he could not ever come back. It was impossible for him to get the job again. The next paragraph, he says, "That year in New Jersey lives in my mind as though it were the year during which, having an unsuspected predilection for it, I first contracted some dread chronic disease, a blind fever, a pounding in the skull and fire in the bowels." So he realized that his color made him different. He could not take things for granted in New Jersey and also in the United States of America. He tells us that this is a feeling that was gradually created in every Negro who is in America. And this turned into a rage in the blood. Okay, so you have to be consciously aware that your skin color, your blackness, makes you different from the white people. Either you have to adjust or adapt with it, you have to surrender to it, or you have to keep on resisting it. Okay, and he says that there was no point in resisting it. Over a period of time, he must have felt that these restrictions were curbing his freedom of thought. They were affecting his mind, and they were preventing him from being the human being that he could become, free from these limitations, free from this repressive atmosphere. "This fever has recurred in me and does and will until the day I die." He says, this rage, this fever will be a part of me until the day I die. He tells us about his last night in New Jersey in the next paragraph. And with a white friend who had come down from New York, he decided that both of them, they decided that they would go to the nearest big town, Trenton, to watch the movies and have a couple of drinks. And on that particular day, something very, very dangerous, something very, very bad happened to James Baldwin, and he was saved by his white friend from the north, from New York. Not a white friend in New Jersey, a white friend who had come from New York. So he says that every single detail of that night, it is alive in his head. He can sort of replay it again and again, all the events that happened on that very difficult, very bad day. So he and his friend, they had gone to Trenton to watch the movie "This Land Is Mine." And it was a movie about the German occupation of France, starring Maureen O'Hara and Charles Laughton. And he remembered the name of the diner. When the movie ended, they went to have dinner, and the diner, the hotel that they went to, the restaurant that they went to, it was called American Diner. So when they went there, James Baldwin, he went and told the waiter that I want to have hamburger and a cup of coffee. What do you think we want? Okay. So he should actually have never gone to that American diner, because again it was a segregated diner. It was a place where only whites were served. But even after repeated experiences, James Baldwin did not learn his lesson. That is something that is surprising for him also, because he says, I do not know why after a year of such rebuffs, I so completely failed to anticipate his answer, which was, of course, we don't serve Negroes here. And when he heard that reply, "We don't serve Negroes here," that also did not upset him. That also did not affect his composure. He made some critical comment, and he said that, "Let's go out." So both of them, they started walking out on the street. And this was a time when America was going through brownout. That is, the electricity supply was probably in a bad shape because all the lights were very dim, even in America. Okay, so they walked through the streets, and the streets were very crowded, and something happened to him. Something happened to Baldwin. He tells us that he saw people were moving in every direction, and all the people he saw all around him, they were all white in color. And that is something that sort of disturbed him, and all the faces were sort of gleaming, were shining. And he felt a physical sensation at the nape of his neck, as though some connection between his head and his body had been cut off. So he thinks about his friend also. He says that he started walking. "I heard my friend call after me, but I ignored him." So he ignored his friend and he started walking ahead, and his friend kept on calling him, but he ignored him. But the friend did not give up on him. The friend followed him. The friend walked along with him, behind him. Okay. And at this point of time, James Baldwin did not have any plan in his mind. He didn't know where he was going. Okay. He saw this restaurant, a very fashionable, huge, glittering, gleaming restaurant, and he decided that he is going to go into that restaurant. His friend was following him. See, by the looks of the restaurant itself, he should have known that it was a place where Negroes would not be admitted. But there was something defiant in him. There was something like a rage burning in him, and he wanted to see how they would treat him. So he pushed open the door and he took the first vacant seat. It was a table for two. He sat there and he waited. He doesn't know how long he waited there, and he doesn't know how he must have looked in that place, because it was a purely predominantly white restaurant. The waitresses were white in color. Everybody was white in color. He was the only black person sitting there waiting for somebody to take his order. Okay. And then what happened? A waitress comes towards him, and the waitress also was very, very anxious. She actually looked scared of Baldwin. And Baldwin's fury, the rage that he was feeling within him, he directed everything at this white waitress. He says, "I hated her for her white face and for her great, astounded, frightened eyes. I felt that if she found a black man so frightening, I would make her fright worthwhile." He decided that he is going to frighten her even more. If she is already frightened of me, then I am going to scare her even more. So she did not come and ask him what he wanted. She kept on making one statement. She kept on repeating one statement, and that statement irritated James Baldwin no end. It added fuel to his fury. She kept on saying, "We don't serve Negroes here." Okay. And she did not say it in a very hostile, defiant, confident, bold manner, in an arrogant manner. She said it in a very submissive manner. She said it with a voice that was filled with fear, with a sense of apology. And this, instead of making Baldwin softer, instead of toning down his anger, it made him even more angry. And he felt that he had to do something with his hands. What he actually wanted to do was, he wanted her to come close enough so that he could get her neck between his hands and squeeze it. Okay. So what he did was, he acted as if he didn't understand what she is saying. So she came closer with a pencil in her hand and a note. Okay. And she kept on saying, "Don't serve Negroes here." With the repetition of that phrase, he became more and more irritated, and there were like bells ringing inside his head. And he came to the realization that the woman is not going to come any more closer to him, but he had to do something. He had to do something. He had to retaliate. He had to react in some way or the other. So there was nothing on that table. There was just an ordinary water cup with water, half full of water. So he picked it up and he threw it at her with all his strength. and she sort of ducked her head, and the cup missed her head. She was not wounded, she was not injured, and it shattered, broke the mirror behind the bar. And then what happened? His frozen blood, it sort of melted, and he realized what he had done. He realized what he was doing. A black man in a white restaurant filled with white people throwing a cup of water at a white waitress. He realized the enormity of what he had done, and he came out. Everybody in the restaurant, all of them, they were shocked, they were shell shocked. But all of them stood up together, and at that moment his instincts kicked in, and he was frightened, and he got up and he started running towards the door. While he was running, there was this big fat round man who grabbed him by the nape of his neck as soon as he reached the door, and he started beating Baldwin about the face. Baldwin kicked him, and he somehow or the other he managed to become free of the man, and he ran into the streets. And his friend, white friend, was still with him, and the friend said, "Run, run," and Baldwin started running. And the white man, he stayed outside the restaurant in order to divert the attention of the people who were rushing out of the restaurant, the white people who were coming out of the restaurant, and the police who had arrived immediately in order to arrest James Baldwin. Anyway, after this adventure, both of them returned to their room, and Baldwin says, "I don't remember what I told my friend that night. I could not have said much. I had somehow betrayed him." He felt that he had let down his white friend very, very badly. So Baldwin kept on playing over that incident in his mind. It kept on coming back to him. He recalled what had happened on that day, and he says that he could not begin to understand two facts. One is that he could have been murdered on that day. All the white people in that restaurant, they could have killed him. And another thing that shocked him even more was that he was capable of killing that waitress. He was capable of committing a murder. And he realized that his life was in danger. He realized that he carried so much hatred within him. He carried so much anger. He carried so much repressed tension within him that he was capable of murdering another human being. And that realization really shocked him. It made him realize that he had to move away in some way or the other from the repression, the oppression that he was encountering in America because of segregation, because of racial inequality. So with this, I conclude my explanation of the first section of Notes of a Native Son. I hope this will help you in understanding this brilliant essay and answering the questions that come up from this. Thank you. See you soon. In the next video, I will be explaining the second part of the essay.